I mean, St. John Paul II is such a critical and popular figure who has touched the lives of literally millions of people, millions of souls. And at the same time, I think there are many things that are misunderstood about him. And one of the things is a very, very, very common misconception is that John Paul II was a phenomenologist. And that's true, but also false.
Right.
He had two doctorates. His first doctorate was in Thomism. It was under the greatest Thomist of the era, Father Reginald Garrigou-Grange, in Rome. He did his dissertation on the idea of faith in St. John of the Cross. And so he is trained in the best Thomism of the 20th century, without a doubt. So he is trained as a Thomist, thinking like a Thomist, but he is also, like St. Thomas, he is not merely repeating what came before, but he's actually applying what came before into a new synthesis, which is exactly what St. Thomas did, which is what Francisco Suarez did to create Suarism. And so what's interesting about him is he's definitely a Thomist. First of all, he's a Thomist. He is definitely a Thomist, but like St. Thomas, he takes on the philosophical problems that are going on in modern philosophy.
Yeah.
And he gets his second doctorate in a man called Max Scheler. Who is Max Scheler? Max Scheler is a German philosopher in the tradition of what I would call Augustinian phenomenology. And the reason I say that is because the term phenomenology is another term that's very misunderstood, because it's a philosophical school of thought which is founded by Edmund Husserl, who is a baptized Jew he was trained with Aristotle under Franz Brentano, who's a Catholic priest, and then his fellow student was Sigmund Freud, fun fact. But what happens was Edmund Husserl founds that his first philosophical efforts are basically what it is a Platonic method, a Platonic methodology of classical realism. And that we need a little bit more breaking down of what that is. Essentially, it's not an Aristotelian methodology, it's a Platonic methodology, but it is a realistic methodology. Realism is the idea that there is absolute truth, basically. There's subjectivism, the dictatorship of relativism that Pope Benedict talked about. There is no absolute truth. Your truth is as good as mine, whatever. Realism is the only philosophy that the church can stomach. Everything else she vomits out, every other form of philosophy. But phenomenology, in its original founding by Edmund Husserl, is realistic, but it is a different methodology, and we could talk more about what that is. But it's different than Aristotle. That's the key. Max Scheler is a disciple of Edmund Husserl. There's two other famous disciples of Edmund Husserl, namely Dietrich von Hildebrand and Edith Stein, aka Saint Teresa Benedicta a Croce. But Max Scheler is kind of the black sheep of those three, because whereas those first two I just mentioned were pious Catholics who died pious Catholics, and one of them's a saint, Max Scheler was not so pious. He was a Catholic, but he actually died excommunicated because he divorced his wife and married again and a bunch of stuff. But before he sort of fell into all this sin, he did write a number of very profound works that had a huge impact on 20th century philosophy. And so all of that to say, finally getting back to the point, is that Karol Wojtyła does his second doctorate on the question, can we use Max Scheler to formulate a system, an ethical system? That's his question for his doctorate, is can we use Max Scheler's thought, his phenomenological system, to create an ethical system? And his answer was no. That was his answer, was that no, you cannot. And the fun fact is that Dietrich von Hildebrand said, yes, you can. And he wrote a book called Ethics on that very thing. But so right there, we can already see that Dietrich von Hildebrand is really a phenomenologist, whereas John Paul II rejects Max Scheler's phenomenological system as a base of ethics. Nevertheless, he does say that one can use this to basically what he's trying to do here is he's trying to fill in certain gaps in Thomism that had not been totally worked out in the Thomistic tradition, namely the reality of the subjective, the reality of the consciousness. And the reason I use that phrase is to, again, distinguish this from subjectivism and relativism, because we all know that we have a conscious subjective experience because it's real. We all experience it. We all know it's real. And this is just a philosophical, metaphysical, epistemological area that St. Thomas and Thomism had not fully explored. They had to explore it to a degree, but St. John Paul II is just going to the depths here, basically, with this text. And ultimately it results in a synthesizing philosophical school called Personalism. So all that to say is...
If I can just...
Yeah, go ahead.
If I can just mention the second volume of the collected works of Wojtyła from Catholic University of America Press is going to include his writings on Max Scheler. I just thought it'd be a good time to point that out.
So that coming soon. I think you'd buy it now, but
I think you can order it now.
Yeah. So all that to say is it's a misconception, and it's also misleading to state that St. John Paul II was a phenomenologist. Part of that is because the original English translation of this work was very faulty and very messed up, because it was unfortunately the Tamienska, the original translator, is now deceased, rest in peace. But she actually kind of decided to translate it, and what she did was she translated it in English, and then she took out all the Latin references to St. Thomas and all these Latin terms and Thomistic terms out of this text.
Right.
And that's what gave the appearance that he's just a phenomenologist. He's not even trying to work within Thomism. But with the new translation CUS Press just came out, translated by Grzegorz Ignatyk, they restored the crucial texts, the crucial aspects of it. This is in the Thomistic tradition, really. Since Aeternam Patris, there's been all these different forms of Thomism. There's this like transcendental Thomism, the Neo-Thomism of the Roman school, all these different forms of applying Thomism to different sort of aspects and forms of modern questions. And this is just another form of that, essentially. But it becomes known as Christian personalism. So you could call it, he's a Christian personalist, or he's a phenomenological Thomist, for example, something like that. But phenomenologist is probably the weaker of the identifiers, I think, when you talk about John Paul II's thought.